Mr. Felix Ellis, a bit of a break on King Island after all the budget talk or work? What is it?
Look, probably mixing a bit of business and pleasure. I recently started playing golf, actually, and been coming over to King Island for years and never played golf here. So had a bit of a chance to catch up with the mayor at Ocean Dunes and have a bit of a hit around there. And I don't think you can really understand how spectacular King Island golf is until you played it. And now to be able to really say from first-hand experience when I speak to people in Tassie or even on the mainland about just how special it is here, it's wonderful.
Well, are we coming to a stage that's going to be the only special thing left on King Island because all the issues we have with Saputo, with the dairy, and I know the Premier is very keen to say that, yeah, it will carry on, we fight and we'll work till it keeps going. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I actually think there's an amazing story still ahead for King Island. I think King Island's brightest days are ahead of it, and it doesn't matter, where you look. There are incredible things about King Island, the dairy, obviously, and the cheese, and we're still really optimistic that we'll be able to find that right buyer. It's things like seafood, it's the tourism, the spectacular physical setting of King Island, but the wonderful community here as well. Even, as you know, some of the more industrial side of things, the kelp, the mining, there's massive, massive opportunities on King Island, and we need to continue to work to support it. But if you look at some of the investments that people are making right across the island in a whole range of different industries, I really do think King Island's best days are ahead of it.
Yeah. One of your portfolios, housing, I'm sure it must be one of the hardest ones. Housing in Tasmania, housing in Australia. It's like, I know I read somewhere that the Labor Party is angry with you that during the Liberal time now, we only build new 6 houses under the banner of the government.
Well, look, that's not quite right. So they're quite focused on a particular pathway. We've got a pipeline of about 800. It's a relatively new pathway. And so some of the, there's been a small number of houses actually built through that. But in terms of our overall picture, with all the tools that we've got, we have a target of 10,000 social and affordable homes by 2032. So we're 3,696 down that pathway. That's a third of the target in a third of the time, which means that we're on track. But we've got more to do. Can I say, Wade, there's big opportunities when it comes to housing construction in Tasmania and on King Island, but we need to continue to back it in. There are some issues that we need to continue to address. Planning is one of those, and King Island is now coming onto the statewide planning scheme, which is really encouraging because it will mean that if people do work in Tassie, on mainland Tassie, and come over to King Island, that they're operating under a similar set of rules. But there's more that we want to look to as well. Key areas like taking the politics out of planning that sadly has seen some great ideas knocked back around our state in the past. That's a really important reform that we're doing and continuing to invest. So the budget's got about $500 million, so $500 million towards more housing for Tasmanians. And that's a big investment, but it's worthwhile because we know that with the state growing, that we need to be investing in roofs that people can put over their heads too.
Talking about planning, I know that we have farmers here on King Island who have, say, coastal land, which is not really good for cattle. They can put a few cows on it, that's it. And they've often asked, why can I not sell my 100-acre lot but subdivide it in, say, 10-acre lots? Because there's plenty of people from the mainland would love to move here, even for a holiday home, don't want 100 acres, but 10, 15 acres would be enough. Don't you think that would be a good idea?
There's certainly some big opportunities to increase some of that rural living.
Yeah.
And we're working through our regional land use strategies at the moment, and that will help guide some of that thinking around how better we can utilise the land that we do have. Land's a precious commodity, and particularly when we're talking prime agricultural land, but other land that's in a rural setting that aligns with some of our existing infrastructure and some of our existing communities too. We think there's some big possibilities there. When our regional land use strategy for the Cradle Coast region, which includes King Island, was established, it was a very different time. It's 12 years ago, we were in a big recession. big downturn, and there wasn't an assumption of growth in there, whereas now you look at our communities and they're growing strongly. There's people investing, there's people wanting to live here, particularly after COVID, wanting a bit more space and smaller communities. And so we need to be thinking about how we can establish a regional land use strategy that backs in growth and backs in people wanting to invest in beautiful communities like King Island.
So how come then that this government has a massive debt? It's like, how do we get away from that?
Well, it's investing for the future. So if you think about some of the things that we've invested in over recent years, they're intergenerational assets, a bit like taking on debt for the family farm to grow and build. That farm's an intergenerational asset. That's a mortgage that's for a good asset like land and property. A lot of our investments have been in that space. So you think about the new Royal Hobart Hospital that a lot of people in King Island utilise if they need to get medical treatment. You think about the new Bridgewater Bridge, that's $750 million, but it will be an asset that we'll get to use for decades to come. And similar in housing too. So as part of this budget, it's an additional $500 million investment. But those on the other side of the ledger to that debt is also good assets. You know, it's like I think a lot of people on King Island would understand. You know, you take on a mortgage, but you get a house on the other side of the ledger. So if you're investing in those good assets, that's going to be a benefit for the future. Now, there's some part of the debt that is not in that category. Things like COVID, about $2 billion, and there's $1 billion in terms of our response to the Commission of Inquiry. That's all about child safety. Now, we have decades of wrongs that we need to address in Tasmania, where we haven't kept our kids as safe as we should have, and we need to fix our systems so that we're keeping kids safe in the future. Now, we think that's that's a good investment. That's the kind of money that the government should be spending, and we need to work through it. It is, of course, a challenge, but those are important things to be investing in.
Would the King Island Airport be a good investment, good asset to expand and get bigger planes in?
Absolutely. I mean, those kind of economic enablers, like the airport, like the Port of Grassy as well, in terms of a seaport. There's money in the budget for revisiting the study and the strategy for that. So we're really keen to work with the federal government, who I know, for example, are on the King Island response team, around what those investments might look like.
Yeah, because when you look at the port, it's like it was your own colleague, Minister Ferguson, who was against an extension or improvement of Grassy Port. Taskports who run the port are against it. So there's not much in favour then for King Island to see that happening, is it?
No, so Minister Ferguson's the Treasurer, and in the budget there's funds for revisiting that study, because if we can make that, if it stacks up and we can continue to invest in that port, you know, King Island's an island, obviously. I
know, but isn't the study then sort of an extension of buying time? So at least we move it 3 or 4 years ahead of us because we have a study now that takes time. So we sort of put it on the back burner a little bit. That's how some people on the island think about it.
Well, you need to get intergenerational infrastructure right. You know, I think a lot of people on King Island would know the frustration of the port not quite being big enough. And so when you think about those investments, it would have been at the time better to build it fit for the future. So sometimes taking a little bit of time to really work through something methodically pays off in the long run because you actually get the right decision. So we're big on that. When we build this kind of intergenerational infrastructure, we want to make sure that it's in the right place, that it's at the right scale, and it takes into account the fact that, you know, we want to see growth here on the island too. So we'll need to work through that. It's complex, and, you know, making sure that it's financially feasible and sustainable for the future is something that we're really going to have to look at. But those kind of port investments and infrastructure investments, whether it's seaport, airport, that's all about growing the possibilities for King Island.
Well, we would think so, yeah. Now, you're also the Minister for Emergency Services. A few weeks ago, the Premier announced that, yes, we're going to build the ambulance hub. Yes, there are going to be 2 community paramedics on the island. He couldn't give me a time frame. When do you think we do get a time frame that the ambulance volunteers that are now have to go home to use the toilet have that facility at the hospital there?
Yeah, so I don't have anything further to update from when you spoke with the Premier. So ambulance is actually I suppose one part of the emergency services that sits with my colleague, the Health Minister. I know he's working through those details, but it's a $5 million investment, as you know, co-located with the hospital, which is actually a much better outcome because our ambulance teams and the hospital need to be working in closely together. So that's a major investment for the island, and it's going to be a big increase in the ability to make sure that we can get King Islanders to the healthcare that they need as quickly as possible and as safely as possible. So we'll continue to work through those details. The budget's just been handed down and it's been funded in the budget. So that's encouraging, and we want to make sure that we get it right.
Talking about emergency services, it's often been discussed here on the island too that with an ageing population, it can be difficult to find volunteers. Now, volunteers is a big word. Volunteer, you can volunteer everywhere. You can make scones for the CWA.
That's right.
But those emergency volunteers, we've often said, should they get some form of a remuneration, even not straight in dollars, but even like a tax incentive or whatever, because some of these people lose hours and days at work because they're on a job fighting a fire all day. So should a government look at that, you think?
Yeah, so this is a really important area, and can I say thank you to all of our emergency service volunteers that we have on King Island. Know many of them personally, caught up with a few last night at the Curry football dinner, football and netball I should say, and just so grateful for their service to this community. So we've been fortunate, we in our emergency services have really identified that if we're focused on resource to the risk that we face in our communities, our most important resource is our people, our volunteers and career staff. So we need to be investing into bringing more of them into our organisations, particularly fire and SES. We have a major increase in terms of our volunteer support unit that backs in all of those volunteers to get the training and the support that they need so that they can continue to do their work. And it's paying dividends. So we've actually in the last 12 months seen another increase in terms of our fire service and our SES volunteers.
Which is great, of course, but would it even further encourage if they had an incentive, had a tax deduction or whatever?
Yeah, look, so this is something that's been looked at over many, many years about whether we should be paying our volunteers. We do have a class of volunteers in the fire service called retained volunteers. So some of our bigger, busier locations, say for example Ulverston in the northwest coast, that's a town of about 15,000 people, and the volunteers there do get paid a stipend. That's why we call them retained volunteers. But other volunteers are really passionate about being a pure volunteer. And so we've raised at different times in consultation around what sort of supports volunteers would like to see. Would they like to get paid a bit? And we often get pushback from volunteers that say, no, this is, I volunteer freely of my time, and we want to make sure that we continue that culture of giving of your time freely so that you can support your community. Now, the National Royal Commission into National Disaster Arrangements also considered the sort of things like, what other supports we can provide, tax incentives and things like that. There's still not strong agreement about where we should go in that space, but we're always open to what more support we can provide. Certainly if you think about some of the campaign bushfires that go for weeks on end, and we have seen those in the past year on King Island, that's a huge commitment for those people. And volunteer fatigue, as we're seeing more frequent and more severe natural disasters in the future, is a big thing. So it's an area that we need to continue to monitor and work with our volunteers to see what supports they need to continue making that kind of contribution to our community.
Back to work?
Back to work.